Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, An Author's Perspective, New Editions. My name is Danny Shapiro, and I'm on the marketing team here at Hawks Learning. Our speaker today is Dr. Paul Sisson. Dr. Sisson is Professor of Mathematics Emeritus and Provost Emeritus and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Louisiana State University, Shreveport. In addition to continuing to teach undergraduate and graduate mathematics throughout his career, he's served in numerous administrative capacities, including department chair, college dean, graduate studies dean, provost, and vice chancellor for academic affairs, and intern chancellor. Dr. Sisson published his first math textbook with Hawks, College Algebra, in 2003, followed by Precalculus in 2006, and College Algebra, A Concise Approach in 2011. Most recently, he's the co-author of Calculus with Early Transcendentals in 2016. Dr. Sisson's teaching experience is reflected in textbook writing, which emphasizes the historical and human aspects of math, calls upon the intuition of the reader, and uses modern technology to enable students to explore mathematics and develop mathematical competence. Dr. Sisson, we are very excited to have you here with us today to talk about the new editions of College Algebra and Precalculus. Audience, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please enter those into the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I want to hand it over to our presenter.
All right, thank you, Danny. That's a very, very nice and comprehensive introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today as we talk about what's new in the third editions of two of my books, College Algebra and Precalculus. Starting with the covers. So the covers are brand new. The covers are beautiful. They feature photographs of these two very nice pieces of mathematical sculpture by the mathematical artist George Hart. I feel like I should probably warn everyone. I love mathematical art. I'm guilty of making some mathematical art myself, and I've given talks on mathematical art. I will try not to turn this talk into a talk on mathematical art, but sometimes it's difficult. So this will be a short talk. I want to just quickly go over first a little bit of my background, some of which you've heard already, and maybe more on what motivates me, both in teaching and in writing. And then we'll get into the details of what is new in these new editions. So I'm thinking probably about 15, 20 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. So a bit more about my background and motivation. And I've scattered some quotations from famous mathematicians through this talk. This is a good one to begin any math talk with. So I am retired now from university life, but when I was a professor, which I was for many, many years, I had just about every possible academic position. So I started off as an assistant professor, moved up through the ranks to full professor, served as a chair of the math department, also an interim chair of a computer science department, dean of the College of Science, graduate studies dean. Spent many years as provost and vice chancellor, which many people know is probably the worst job on a college campus. And then closed out my university career serving 25 months as interim chancellor. So I am retired now from university life. I live in a beautiful place in the middle of New Mexico. Spend much more time writing now and doing a lot of volunteer work, some of which is I volunteer as a math tutor for the small town, the nearest small town, which is about half an hour away from me. My latest student who I tutored was the mayor of that town, and I tutored him as he went through applied calculus. As I said, I was a professor for many years. I go back long enough that when I started teaching, the only tool or the only tools at our disposal were ourselves, a book, chalkboard, and chalk. And I want to just kind of list what we get to use these days, because all these tools are on my mind as I write. The fact that, of course, we still use books, but now books might be in print or electronic form. We have all the resources of the internet. We have some really nice intelligent tutoring software, such as what Hawks turns out. We have terrific technology, Mathematica, graphing calculators, other software. And I think we're just a lot more knowledgeable now than we used to be about different teaching strategies and different ways that students learn and how to measure learning effectiveness. And amplifying that last point just a bit more, the ways in which we teach, the formats of our teaching, that has certainly increased in number and diversity over the years, starting again with the traditional lecture format. But we have so many different ways of teaching now, especially this year. Many professors are finding themselves forced, or possibly voluntarily, using ways that are relatively new. So online teaching, taking advantage of smaller group work, active learning is so much more prevalent, so much more encouraged than it used to be. And one of my favorite techniques is to encourage students to teach other students. Over the many years that I taught, and I should say even for all those years that I served in administrative capacities, I always taught at least one math class a semester. That was for my benefit, if nothing else. I did that because teaching is actually, it was one of the few things I enjoyed, certainly a lot more than administrative work. And it was actually something I've been trained in, as opposed to, as most of us who wind up being administrators know, there is no training for administrative work, not very much. But as I taught, I developed a number of principles, philosophies that certainly informed my teaching and ultimately guided my writing. And I want to go over these because these principles, if nothing else, they serve to differentiate my books from other books, many other books. Certainly guides what I do as I write. Starting with one that this was certainly rare when I was a student, the idea of incorporating history and context into math instruction. I think that's just immensely important, and I do it constantly. Another thing that was rare when I was a student, calling upon the intuition not just of the learner, but pointing out that mathematicians use intuition as they're developing the math that students are learning. Encouraging and inspiring exploration, providing ample and many different kinds of developmental exercises, constantly emphasizing understanding over memorization, seamlessly integrating technology. I'm a big fan of technology. I use it constantly. What I want to do when I write and also when I taught was just to point out that technology is just it naturally meshes with mathematics. It's not something to be tacked on. Certainly in books, I don't like to see it tacked on as an afterthought. I like to see it seamlessly incorporated into the text. Always maintaining rigor and precision. And finally, maybe most importantly, when I write a book that is meant to be read as opposed to simply a collection of bullet points. A few quotes from mathematicians who echo that thought that mathematics is a creative art. And again, another idea that is rarely, or at least used to be rarely encountered in the classroom, but something I really try to emphasize that mathematics is a creative endeavor. Well, on the flip side of all those guiding principles are bad practices that I've encountered over the years. And I'm not actually bitter about these because bad practices can be inspirational as well. So going back decades when I was a student, and then more recently as I look at some other books, These are the things that I don't like to see, and avoiding these practices also informs the way I write. So math without history, math without the humanity or the context, math without any goals, formulas that simply appear without motivation or development, cookie cutter procedures that de-emphasize understanding and thought. And I don't mind sidebars, but sidebars need to be related to the text. They need to actually augment instead of distract from the text. So let's move on to the details of what is new in these third editions. And I think I've reached the stage of my life where this quote needs no further discussion. I thought some of you might be interested in just the process of revising books. It's a very long process, at least the way I and my colleagues at Hawks go about it. And it starts immediately after any edition appears and starts to be used. We immediately start to collect recommendations, suggestions, anyone who's pointing out any typos or other errors in the book. We collect all those and we immediately start to form what winds up being a giant spreadsheet with all of these comments and suggestions ultimately organized pretty carefully. And that goes on for several years. And then the actual writing process takes another couple of years. So for these third editions, beginning sometime around midway through 2018, I and my colleagues at Hawks, we began the work of laying out the new material, reorganizing things, coming up with a reorganized table of contents, doing some other preliminary work, refining that giant spreadsheet that had all the comments and suggestions. And then in 2019, for 10 months of 2019, I did the actual writing. And of course, that's also a back and forth process. So for me, that's about 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for 10 months, which is not as bad as it sounds. I'm a morning person by nature. I wake up very early in the morning, and the way I live now, I'm able to start that 10 hours of writing very early, take a break mid-morning for a hike with my wife and dogs, and then finish up mid to late afternoon and have the rest of the day free. So it really isn't as bad as it sounds, and it is an enjoyable process for me. I enjoy writing. It is back and forth. So as I write, I'm constantly sending work back to my team at Hawks, and they have suggestions. Ultimately winds up going to reviewers outside of Hawks, and they also have suggestions. So all of that is incorporated as I continue that writing process. That finished up in November of 2019, and then we still had another half year or so of final layout work to do, refining figures and so on. Ultimately, all of the facts and figures are painstakingly checked, and literally every page winds up being updated and improved somehow. So it's a very exhaustive, comprehensive process. It does take a lot of time, but again, it is something that's really fairly enjoyable for me. So the end result of all that, both College Algebra 3rd edition and Precalculus 3rd edition have a new chapter entitled Working with Functions. The 3rd edition of Precalculus has another new chapter, which is devoted to limits, continuity, and the derivative. That's the very last chapter of the book. There are a number of new sections. Now, in all cases, the new chapters, the new sections, this is not always entirely new material. It of course incorporates old material that has been refined and improved, but then a lot of new material that has been worked in. So certainly with these new sessions, there was material on mathematical modeling in the past, but no session that was simply devoted to mathematical models. And now there is. I'm very, very proud of the way that turned out. And that's the new session in both books. I'm especially happy with the business applications, which I think are as realistic and relevant as possible in a fairly introductory book. So very happy to see how that turned out. The pre-calculus book has a brand new section on hyperbolic functions. And that's something that's relatively rare in pre-calculus books. I hope I'm starting a trend with this idea. I really want to do that because harking back to my teaching days, I remember well the experience of teaching Calculus 1, getting to the point where we discuss hyperbolic functions, and often the book would just assume or pretend that students had already had experience with hyperbolic functions. But of course, that's often not the case. Hyperbolic functions are often encountered for the first time in calculus, and that's a rude awakening. It's a rough transition to make when you first are expected to learn a brand new class of functions and then instantly start to use them, differentiate them, and apply them in various applications. So I really want to have a session on hyperbolic functions in a pre-calculus book. And again, I'm very happy with the way that turned out. There are many, many new or expanded topics, and I'll quickly go through this list. Again, some of these appeared in previous editions, but they've been expanded. Some of them are brand new to these editions. So linear regression, quadratic regression, I think a much better discussion of intervals of monotonicity, better discussion, more comprehensive discussion of properties of functions. This is relatively new, so interpolation and extrapolation, better discussion of how to stretch graphs horizontally, local extrema, average rate of change, which leads into that last chapter of the pre-calculus book, exponential regression, logistic models. I think logistic models, again, turned out very well in these books. They're introduced in a realistic and relevant fashion, and I take advantage of population models quite a bit in talking about logistic models. Logarithmic regression, solving elementary logarithmic equations, better discussion of systems of linear inequalities and nonlinear inequalities, transition matrices, and the multinomial theorem. New methodology. So for pre-calculus, this was a much requested alternate take on the development of the trig functions. So there is a new section on trig functions and the unit circle. In both books, the chapter on functions was split into two chapters. One that introduces functions and is titled Relations, Functions, and Their Graphs. And then the second chapter is simply devoted to working with functions. A number of sections have been split into two sections. So college algebra section on polynomials is now split into two sessions. Both books now have sessions devoted individually to linear functions and quadratic functions. And both books have a section on transformation of functions and a separate section on properties of functions. And then finally, a lot of work went into expanding and reorganizing the exercise sets. So they all are now organized following this framework of practice, applications, technology, and writing and thinking. And I think my timing is just about right on. That was 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Sisson. Again, to our audience, you can submit questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them out. Dr. Sisson, can you talk just a little bit more about, you just showed those exercise sets and how you broke them down into 4 categories. Can you talk a little bit more about each category and specifically explain those?
Sure. So I think the names of the categories are pretty descriptive and well chosen. And again, exercises in these different categories existed in previous editions, but they were not so explicitly well organized. So practice is just what it sounds like. Those are, and that's the bulk of every exercise set. A lot of practice problems, again, really emphasizing diversity of problems. Applications, that's usually a little bit shorter session, and that does focus on bringing in business applications or applications from physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. Technology are exercises that are specifically designed to take advantage of technology. So they're problems that often can be done without technology, but they are more enjoyable if you are able to take advantage of technology. And the use of technology in my books, every technology application or exercise is doable with a TI-84, but they're also written in such a way that whatever technology you have, whether you're using a different graphing calculator or software like Mathematica or Maple or MATLAB, they're all amenable to whatever technology you have. And then writing and thinking that's more philosophical in nature.
Okay, thank you very much. And one other thing I just, before we go, I'm hoping you can just talk briefly about is the integrated review products and some of the new sections there, and how many we added and why we added so many.
Yeah, so the integrated review books are designed to help students who maybe they've been away from math for a while and they need some additional resources to feel comfortable in what they're learning, or it could simply be an additional resource for students who are going right through math class after math class. The same principles applied, though. We expanded the content of all the integrated review books. So more exercises, more diverse exercises, and of course everything is coordinated with the text.
Okay, well, Dr. Sisson, again, I want to thank you so much for giving us this brief rundown and overview of these new editions. Audience, thank you very much for attending today. We did record this session, and we'll be following up with a recording in case you missed part of it and need to go back and watch. If you do think of questions, you can email us at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we will be able to get back to you or pass them on to Dr. Sisson and make sure that you get a response. Again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.